Have you ever wondered how the Germans were able to take over the entire country of France in only 6 weeks? Or more generally, how come bigger countries like France and the Soviet Union get taken over so quickly in some cases? And why does it sometimes seem like a couple thousand elite soldiers can take down an entire nation? It's me, and this is my channel. And in this episode, we're going to answer these questions by examining how France fell in World War II. After only 6 weeks of fighting, French leadership was forced to sign an armistice with the Germans, giving up northern and western France to the invaders. This rapid German victory is all the more surprising when we consider that at the time, France was the third largest power in the world. The French army had the second largest budget in the world and the second largest military force. Only the British Empire was larger. France also possessed some of the most modern tanks in the world, as well as fortifications that had been built out of fear of a German invasion. These included the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along France's eastern border with Germany. So how could such a powerful nation be defeated so quickly? Well, one reason was that the French were fighting a defensive war. That is, they were trying to defend their homeland from a foreign invader. As Clausewitz wrote in his book on war, defending a country makes it harder to wage war than attacking one. Because when you're defending your own territory, you have a front line that is hundreds or even thousands of miles long, while the attacker only has to guard a single line of communication to their rear. After all, Britain is also fighting a defensive war in a sense, but it did not collapse as quickly as France. The real reason France fell so quickly was because its leadership made a serious strategic blunder. In fact, the biggest strategic blunder in the history of warfare. The first few weeks of the war went about as badly for the French as they possibly could have imagined. Within a day of the German invasion, France's allies, Belgium and the Netherlands, had fallen. With the fall of Belgium, the Germans had advanced to the English Channel and split France in half. So the French High Command decided to pull back their troops from the Maginot Line and instead focus on defending the narrowest part of France, near the city of Amiens. Here, the Germans would have to cross a river called the Somme in order to advance further into northern France. The idea was that if the Germans crossed the river, the French would attack them there and destroy them. There was just one problem with this plan. It didn't account for the possibility that the Germans would simply bypass the river instead. You see, the Germans had a secret weapon that the French weren't aware of. It was called Blitzkrieg, which literally translates to lightning war. Blitzkrieg was a new style of warfare that relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. The Germans would use fast-moving tanks and aircraft to quickly break through enemy lines, then follow up with infantry and artillery. Now Blitzkrieg was not a new invention. In fact, it had been used for centuries before World War II. Sun Tzu, for instance. In fact, the Germans had already tested it out against the Poles during the invasion of Poland. You see, after the fall of France, many people, including Winston Churchill, believed that the Germans had stumbled upon a sort of magic formula for winning wars. This is because before Blitzkrieg, most wars were fought like this. Armies would line up across from each other and try to destroy each other in one great battle. But this wasn't how the Germans fought, and it wasn't even how they planned to fight. Instead, they focused on taking out key cities and military positions quickly and methodically. But the thing is, the Germans were still bound by the laws of physics, which meant that no matter how fast they moved, this is what ultimately allowed the Polish to inflict heavy casualties on the Germans. However, the Polish were unable to capitalize on this advantage, and as soon as the Germans broke through their lines, they collapsed. So when the French High Command ordered their troops to attack the Germans, the moment they crossed the Somme. However, there is one massive difference between the French and the Germans. While the Germans had a deep pool of trained and experienced soldiers thanks to their massive investment in their military, the French did not. This was because, throughout the 1920s and 30s, the French public had grown increasingly disinterested in the military, and as a result, the French government reduced the size of the military and lowered defense spending. Unfortunately for the French, this would prove to be a fatal mistake. While the French had several elite units, such as the Foreign Legion and the Chasseurs, These units were woefully outnumbered by the regular conscript army. And as soon as the French regulars faced off against the Germans, they were quickly routed. And here's why that happened. You see, despite having more men than the Germans, the French suffered from something called coordination loss. Coordination loss happens when units within an army are not properly trained or led, and it causes soldiers to act independently rather than as a cohesive unit. This often results in friendly fire, wasted resources, and needless casualties. Now, coordination loss happens to everyone, but it's especially common among untrained or poorly led soldiers. And that's exactly what happened to the French. Not only were the French conscripts completely inexperienced, but the French officers were also unfamiliar with the new tactics being employed by the Germans. As a result, the French ended up wasting a lot of their firepower on friendly troops. They also failed to properly coordinate their attacks, which gave the Germans time to regroup and launch counterattacks. But that's not all. The French were also hobbled by the fact that they were trying to defend too much territory. Remember, the French had pulled back from the Maginot Line and focused on defending the area around Amiens. This meant that they were trying to defend a long, thin slice of France, which required them to spread their forces to thin. In addition, by pulling back from the Maginot Line, the French left behind a large number of supply depots. This gave the Germans a huge logistical advantage over the French. So once the Germans broke through the main French defenses, it was pretty much game over. At that point, the only question was how far the Germans would be able to push before the French could mount a meaningful defense. Ultimately, the Germans pushed all the way to the English Channel, splitting France in half. There are some who say that the French actually did manage to inflict heavy casualties on the Germans, but that's a myth. The only reason it seems like the French inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans is because the French systematically destroyed their records of German casualties. This was done in order to keep up morale among the French troops. The reality was that the French were completely and utterly crushed in every engagement with the Germans. The few French soldiers who survived the fighting either surrendered or fled to Britain. And that brings us to the last reason France fell so quickly. The French leadership simply did not believe that Germany could win a war. For years, French leaders had been telling their citizens that the French army was invincible. They pointed to the Maginot Line as evidence of this. So when the Germans began their invasion, many French leaders refused to believe that Germany stood a chance. They thought that the Germans would be bogged down on the Maginot Line within a few weeks. So they were very reluctant to commit their troops to the fight. This reluctance was most evident in the actions of the French commander-in-chief. Gamelin was the highest-ranking officer in the French army, and was responsible for planning and directing the French defense of France. But he made a series of blunders that ultimately led to the collapse of the French army. First, he refused to believe that the Germans could win a war, which led him to make a series of bad decisions. Second, he was slow to recognize the threat posed by Britain. And third, he was slow to realize that the war was lost. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.